muchas gracias a todos por venir y muchas gracias, porque esto es casi, bueno, un cónclave, no digo que secreto, pero discreto, porque vamos a tocar temas que no son los más populares y los que más ayudan a un político a hacer una buena carrera, pero bueno, esto es así. Bien. Comprender la violencia humana es difícil, debido a muchos factores implicados, ya que no todos se encuentran exactamente bajo nuestro control. Estos factores abarcan del entorno familiar al social e incluso al legal. Pero también pasa por rasgos de personalidad individual, predisposiciones genéticas y el concurso de elementos biológicos, como hormonas, neuropéptidos, tú ya te vas a explayar aquí, asociados con conductas antisociales. Se trata de un problema que requiere un análisis multidisciplinar, en el que tomen parte no solo políticos y donde la evidencia científica ocupe un lugar central. Hace pocos días, con ocasión del evento Standing Up for Science, que se llevó a cabo en este Parlamento, bueno, pues ya insistí en que la ciencia tiene que jugar un mayor papel en la política, es indispensable. Por eso me alegro de que la ciencia sea hoy la protagonista, porque justo nos acompañan 3 estudiosos europeos, aquí siempre lo hacemos todo europeo, de temas sobre agresión humana. Hoy estamos más sensibilizados que hace décadas con la violencia familiar y de pareja, pero esto no significa que haya más. Steven Pinker refiere que en Estados Unidos íntima contra las mujeres ha disminuido en casi 2/3 desde los años 90, mientras que el índice de asesinados por sus parejas, tanto víctimas femeninas como masculinas, sigue disminuyendo desde los años 70. Eso lo tenemos que tener en cuenta. Tampoco significa que el problema sea poco importante, cuidado. La violencia familiar y de pareja sigue siendo un problema global necesitado de explicaciones y de soluciones. Según la OMS, 1 de cada mujeres experimentan alguna clase de violencia íntima o de violencia sexual a lo largo de sus vidas. Los hombres, sin embargo, están lejos de ser inmunes a ese tipo de violencia, como muestran literalmente cientos de estudios a lo largo de décadas. He aquí un punto importante para entender la violencia íntima y familiar. Los hombres y los niños también son víctimas. Este hecho sigue siendo políticamente difícil de digerir. Me atrevo a decir que por 2 razones fundamentales. En primer lugar, como subraya también uno de nuestros ponentes, Joaquín Suárez, la atención por las víctimas masculinas sigue percibiéndose como si se robara recursos morales y económicos destinados a las víctimas femeninas. Una especie de desafortunado argumento de suma cero. La segunda razón es menos ideológica, pero más profunda y psicológica. Simplemente las sociedades humanas tienden a ser menos sensibles al sufrimiento masculino. La psicóloga social Tania Reynolds documenta que este sesgo, favoreciendo a las mujeres, persiste a través de las culturas y llega a la conclusión no tan sorprendente de que la gente apoya más fuertemente las políticas que benefician a las mujeres. Me preocupa que este sesgo esté afectando incluso a los niños y los adolescentes, grandes olvidados, y aquí en el Parlamento bastante, en temas como la violencia familiar y sexual, donde sabemos que están afectados de forma nada trivial. Nuestra invitada, Nicola Graham-Kevan, nos aportará a buen seguro datos sobre esto. El evento de hoy representa la culminación de un largo trabajo precedido por una pregunta parlamentaria que hicimos hace unos meses sobre violencia familiar y víctimas masculinas dirigida a la Comisión Europea. Nuestra intención es, ante todo, presentar la evidencia científica que, a nuestro entender, debería orientar el debate social, legal y político. Para ello presentamos un nuevo estudio que aborda la violencia familiar y de pareja de una forma inclusiva, documentando los patrones de género en agresión a lo largo de las distintas regiones mundiales, elaborando razones para intentar explicar el persistente rechazo de la evidencia y, finalmente, sugiriendo algunas recomendaciones. Ese estudio ha sido elaborado por Joaquín Suárez, profesor emérito de la Universidad Mid-Sweden, que ya había participado en un proyecto sobre violencia familiar en Europa financiado por la Comisión Europea, por Nicola Graham-Kevan, experta en psicología de la agresión de la Universidad de Central Lancashire, y por 2 autores más, Orion Sundin, también de la Universidad de Mid-Sweden, y Gloria Macasa, de la Universidad de Gabla, que no están aquí. Además, tenemos la suerte de contar con una joven investigadora española, Marta Iglesias Julios, estudiante de doctorado en el programa de neurociencia Champalimot y una activa divulgadora científica, en Twitter, en todas partes, muy presente. Fue la primera autora española en publicar un artículo en la revista Quilet, una revista especialmente en contracorriente, y con un título significativo, Why Feminists Must Understand Evolution. Y cuenta ya con un libro en su haber, Nuestra herencia animal, la importancia de la historia evolutiva en el comportamiento, que lo editó El País hace unas semanas, que nadie encuentra, y yo tampoco he podido encontrar, pero en fin, estamos en ello. Sí. Marta nos hablará de la agresión femenina desde la evolución, una introducción magnífica al tema que nos trae hoy aquí. Quisiera mostrar a todos los invitados mi más sentido agradecimiento y el de mi equipo por su gran trabajo. En el caso de Nicola es ya la segunda colaboración y, por supuesto, extiendo la bienvenida pues, a todos ustedes que nos visitan hoy y porque no cabe duda de que han venido porque tienen un interés sincero. Espero que haya más oportunidades para seguir trabajando en este tema tan controvertido que afecta tanto a nuestro bienestar y seguridad y también a la gente que queremos, nuestros padres, nuestros hijos, hermanos, amigos, conciudadanos. Pues ahora vamos a dar la palabra y el primero que nos va a hablar va a ser Joaquín. Adelante, Joaquín.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, the opportunity. Do I need a microphone?
Yes, you do. Yes.
Okay, thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity to talk about the subject that it is very near my heart. In a sense, it's amazing but tragic. Here you have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of women and men who are abused almost on a daily basis and sometimes severely, but you only hear talking about violence against women. Even more tragic is to think that you can solve the problem of violence against women without taking into account the violence against men. They go together. It's like a coin. It has two sides. And somehow we have arrived, we are only looking at one side. So I decided, together with my colleagues and in collaboration with your group, to talk about violence against men, but in a different way. Because usually they talk either about women or about men. And I have chosen only studies with both women and men. So I will present data about that. From different continents, from Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, and English-speaking industrialized countries. Okay. What is intimate partner? Intimate partner is a person with whom one has a relationship. It could be a boyfriend, a spouse, a husband, a wife. And I've decided to focus on physical intimate partner violence. Because in the beginning I want to talk about physical, psychological, sexual and consequences, and I say, my God, it's impossible to do this kind of work. So I focus today on physical intimate partner violence. Physical violence is when you have the intention to use physical violence, which has the potential to cause death, disability, injury. The situation today is like that. Most research and funding goes to study violence against women and the consequences. It's very difficult to get funding to study men or to study both at the same time. Organizations like the WHO involved in domestic violence, they concentrate almost 100% on women as victims and men as perpetrators, which I found very strange, and I don't know why. I have an idea why, but it's a bit controversial. Most prevention, treatment, and sheltering strategies are related to women. I don't know if in Spain there is, or in France there is shelters for men, or I don't know. There are very few shelters for men. Prevention is always about violence against women, and the same thing is treatment. The policies, the regulations, and the laws are all oriented towards women. I would call them sexist. I know only one country in Europe, and perhaps in the world, that have a natural domestic violence law. It's Portugal. Taking an example of Spain, Spain is an extreme. The laws in Spain are extreme. It's unbelievable. And another problem is that every time you talk about violence against men or women, they raise the patriarchal society. Because we live in a patriarchal society, man uses violence to dominate women. But, my God, I cannot find support for that. And Nicola, she knows the subject very well about that. Yet we have hundreds of studies, and I mean 300, 400, 500 studies that without doubt show that violence is not what people think it is. And if you look at media, most of the times, if there is some case of violence, they only present extreme cases of women who are victimized and men always as a perpetrator. So what I have done, now, what are the obstacles to put forward the violence against men? It's ideological. There is a part that is ideological. I'm sorry to say, but there is, especially in the new feminism, they put forward this idea that domestic violence is an activity of man that man uses to dominate the woman. Another way why they don't put the violence against men forward is that they conceal the evidence. That is, they have studied both men and women, but only present data about women. The media is another actor in this. The media likes to present cases of female victimization more than male, special, very extreme cases. I think part of this, why people don't talk, or the WHO, the Union European, don't bother so much about violence against men, I think, personally, is to defend feminism. Because we live in a patriarchal system, and because violence, because men abuse women to dominate and control women, if we start to talk about that, it will be problematic for the patriarchy as a causes of violence. But violence, like you said, is a very complex thing, social, biological, but they don't talk about this. And they are also afraid that if we talk about violence against men, somehow we take money from which is used for treating or sheltering or preventing violence against women. I think it's an absurd idea, really, because they go together. So what I have done, I've looked as best I could data concerning the occurrence of physical violence, using only studies with women and men. And the data concern university students, middle school students, clinical cases, general population, and community samples. The data is from Africa, Asia and the Pacific, Europe and the Caucasus, Latin America and the Caribbean, the Middle East, and industrialized speaking nations like Australia, Canada, New Zealand, UK, and United States. So here is Africa. I look at 28 studies from 18 countries, you can see, and the number of subjects in these studies were 71,812, and the number of women were 34,087 women. It were university students, other students, adolescents, clinical population, general population, community samples. When I put the pooled frequency, when I put together the frequency, I found when it comes to victimization in Africa, 15.8% of the women are victimized and 35% of the men are victimized. It's a different, but the difference is not so big. So we can say we are looking about some kind of symmetry. Of course, the range differs. The range is very, very large. You have 2%, 60%, 50%. But when I put together, I come to these numbers. It's possible that there are more studies, but I didn't find it. It took a lot of time. And then I looked also in Africa concerning perpetration. And remarkably, I only found 8 studies from 3 countries. And I wonder, why don't they look at perpetration? And the number of subjects were 23,298. Most of them were women. Again, students, clinical population, general population, community samples. The results show that 19.7% of women, they are the abusers. They abuse men. And 25.1% of men abuse women. So once again, the numbers are not so different. And it's quite interesting because many people have this idea that in Africa everyone is beating each other and that the abuse of women is very high, etc. But it's more or less the same. Then I go to Asia. There I found 15 studies from 9 countries. Again, the same population, I don't need to repeat. You can see the number of people. It's about 24%, 24,000. Here, what we found is that again, the same thing. A bit, 29.9% of the victimization was against women, and here is a bit more against men, 21%. Naturally, the range is very, very high. So it's not big. It's almost like Africa, although a bit on the other side. In Asia, I found 18 studies from 12 countries concerning perpetration, with almost 27%, 27,000 women. Here, women were more abusive than men. 21.3% of women abused men, and 16.8% were men who abused the women. So there is some difference between Africa and Asia, but not that much. Once again, the numbers are more or less the same. Then I look at Europe, and I found 15 studies from 9 countries. Some from Spain. I think I found 4 studies from Spain, or 5 studies. I don't remember exactly. Where, interestingly enough, there was more victimization more victimization against men than against women. And the population is about the same. And 80% of women were victimized, and 77% of men. So again, it's 1% here, 1% there, 2%. And these studies in Spain are quite interesting because they are very large. Most of them are students, but they are very large. And that is clear that there is more violence against men than against women. And then they did the same concerning interpretation. There I found 26 studies from 15 countries, and the population was about 22,000. And here the women were have a tendency to abuse men more often than the opposite. 23% of women abused men, and 21.2% of men abused women. So once again, we can see symmetry. I go very quickly. And then I look at Latin America. People have this idea of Latin America where is there a lot of abuse of women, and that men are the perpetrators. So I found 13 studies from 9 countries: Barbados, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Grenada, Jamaica, Mexico, Trinidad, Tobago, and Venezuela. And here you see something quite interesting, is that men are more victimized than women. It's almost a difference of 5%. And we are talking about university students, adolescent, clinical, general population, and community samples. This is victimization. And when it comes to perpetration, I found 11 studies from 7 countries. And here is perhaps the biggest difference of all the countries. Here are women more, they tend to abuse men more often than men. 33.8, almost 34% of women abuse men, and 24% of men abuse women. It's quite interesting.
Yes.
The Middle East, it's a problem because it's very difficult to do studies in the Middle East where you ask both men and women. So I found only 4 studies, one from Israel, Pakistan, Tunisia, and Turkey. And the Middle East is a bit different because there I can see there is more violence against women than against men. But I only found 4 studies, so it's very difficult to have an idea how it is in the Middle East. The perpetration here is also differs from the other regions. Here is more perpetration from man to woman than the opposite. But you see the numbers are very high. But I found only 2 studies, one from Israel and one from Iran. So here I cannot say that the situation is better or worse than in other countries. And then I look at English-speaking countries, and it's there where you found most of the studies. I found 78 studies from 5 countries: Australia, Canada, New Zealand, UK, and USA. And here, in these countries, men are more victimized than women. It's not a big difference, but still it's about 2%. The populations are quite the same, but of course the range is very, very broad. And I found the same thing about perpetration. Women in these countries tend to be more violent than men. So, my conclusion is that I looked at 153 studies concerning victimization from 54 countries, 6 regions, with almost 500,000 people. We are talking 500,000 people. We are not talking about 1,000. And if you look, the rate of victimization was slightly higher among men than women. It was a bit wrong there, but very highly. And you have the numbers from each region when concerns women and men. And when I look at the final numbers, you will see that was a bit more victimization against men than against women. When I come to perpetration, we have the opposite side. We have 151 studies, 44 countries, 6 regions, and again, almost 500,000 people. And if you look at the perpetration total, it was a bit more perpetration from women to men than the opposite. So my conclusion is the present review, I think it adds evidence to the symmetry of abuse. Improvements have happened, but yet IPV against men are still not given the attention that it deserves. Not much attention has been paid to abuse of men at the national and international levels. Policymakers, social healthcare planners and providers, official and non-official organizations work with violence, funding providers, the media and the public. It's urgent to modify, it's really urgent to modify prevention and treatment approaches to include victimized men and to accept that there is symmetry in physical violence. Also important is the modification of policies, regulations, and laws about EPV by including men as victims and accept the symmetry of physical EPV. Organizations such as United Nations and European Union ought to change their approach to EPV and funding. It's almost impossible to get funding here. And it's also important to involve the media, because the media is very important to spread out the information to the public. The public don't know about this. The only message they hear is that women are victims and men are perpetrators. And I believe to solve this terrible problem, we need both. We are not helping the woman because we forgot the other part. Thank you for listening to me.
Ahora vamos a pasar a la intervención de Nicola Graham Kivan, que nos va a hablar también sobre agresión contra los hombres. Adelante.
Okay, well, we're finding my slides. Thank you for having me. So it's nice to get out of England for a little bit of time. So today I'm going to talk about the impact of witnessing domestic violence on children. I can talk about coercive control in the questions if anyone's interested, because I've done quite a lot of work on that. But we thought the impact on children was quite an important topic to discuss. Just wait for the slides. I don't know. It disappeared. I sort of remember the first slide, so I'll start. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk very briefly about adverse childhood experiences. I don't know how interested people are in that in Europe. It's certainly a really growing concern in England, and certainly the World Health Organization and the European Union have work published around the importance of reducing adverse childhood experiences. So I'm going to talk briefly about that. Then we're going to talk about prevalence of exposure for boys and girls to the parental violence between parents. Then we're going to talk about what are the outcomes for children who have been exposed to this in childhood, adulthood, a little bit about protective factors, and then a brief slide on implications. So if anyone's looked at the adverse childhood experiences work and you've gone online, you can do your ACE test. So what you do is you look at these questions and you give yourself one answer. For each question you say, yes, that happened to me. And then you can look at lots of graphs and see what the outcomes are for people who have a similar profile to you. But within here, item 2, did your parents ever experience being pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at them, or been hit so hard that they were injured or had a mark? That's one of the 10, well, I've got 11 here, 10 or 11 questions that are always asked. Now, domestic abuse exposure is often the most prevalent of all the adverse childhood experiences. So if we can reduce child exposure, then we're going to reduce a lot of adversity. That's why it's really important for us to think about this topic. So what I did was I had a look at the literature, and there are tens of thousands of articles on this. So what I decided to do was look at the literature, the review articles, so articles that are published where they have collected data on lots and lots, all the studies available, and then put them into one place. So I looked at about 20 review articles over the last decade. And these are just, not all the figures, just a sort of example. As you can see, that generally exposure to violence between parents, domestic violence, is pretty similar for boys and girls. If there's any difference at all, it tends to be that girls see a bit more of it, and which is interesting because boys and girls are equally in the home. But actually what we find is girls tend to be in the house more, and boys tend to be outside a little bit more. So maybe girls are more aware of domestic abuse because they tend to be inside the family home, on average, more hours than boys are inside the family home. There may be other explanations, but that's the one I've seen in the literature. But generally, rates go from 50% of children down to about 8-10% of children, so quite a lot of variation. So peer-reviewed papers from 2009 to 18, 14 reviews of all the other research, and again, they came from all over the globe. All of the studies I looked at had boys and girls in them. I didn't look at any studies that only looked at girls or only looked at, well, there are no studies that only look at boys, but there's quite a few that only look at girls. And I looked at when it was available, sex of violent parent, sex of child, and then tried to look at the outcome across the developmental time period. So EIPV is exposure to interparental violence. I got bored of typing it, so I thought I'd make an acronym, make it easy. And it is a robust, cross-sectional, so where we ask people as an adult what happened to them and how they are now. That's a cross-sectional study. Longitudinal, where we've actually followed people from birth all the way through to 30, 40 years old. So that's really good, very robust research. We find that it is a really good predictor of whether you're going to go on to be violent in your relationships. So for boys and girls, if you witness your parents using violence to each other, it is a very good predictor that you will also use violence when you grow up towards your partner. It increases the odds about 4.5 times if you've been exposed. There is no significant difference whether you see your father hit your mother or your mother hit your father. The impact is the same. So it's not that, mums may be hitting dads and dads hitting mums, but actually dad's violence is so much scarier and more harmful. There's no evidence for that in the literature. There's no difference with a male child being exposed or a female child. It harms boys and girls in a very similar way. There's no significant interaction with the perpetrator sex or the child. So there's this idea that if boys see dad hitting mum, he'll be a perpetrator, and if girls see mum being hit, she'll be a victim. This is how it's always spoken about in the literature that I read, building on social learning theory. But actually the research doesn't say that. If girls see mum hitting dad, it's the same as if girls see dad hitting mum. Being exposed to violence is an adverse childhood experience. It's not about patriarchy. To the child, it is a distressing occurrence, often a chronic one, which impacts on the whole developmental process of that child. Parental exposure is this risk factor for boys and girls to go on to have significant problems in their own lives. So, if you're exposed to partner violence growing up, you're more likely to be depressed as an adult. And your exposure doesn't matter if you're too young to actually vocalise it, even if it's pre-language. We know tiny infants are very sensitive to threat. And you can have these little studies we do at my university where you have a little camera on the baby's face. And when you show threatening stimuli to a small child, a baby, it will stare at it for a long time. And the thing with very young children is they can't disengage. So where an older child will actually, if something's distressing me, will try and look away, babies don't. They just watch. So they have no way really of protecting themselves. They are completely exposed and unable to turn away from that threatening stimuli. And we see that again up to 3-7 years old. There's still that tendency that the child can't. So we know young children exposed to violence are at this risk of having a heightened threat system. So if you look at neurocognitive models of the impact of childhood trauma, you see that if you use brain imaging, you can actually see the impact on how the brain responds to threat as people grow up. So you will see that if somebody's been exposed to chronic aggression growing up through their parents, you will see that that person actually seems to have quite a high threat level. On resting, normal, a good day, you're quite hyper alert. So you're probably feeling quite stressed generally. And then if you're exposed to any additional stresses, your emotional experience is very fast and it's very hard. So that's what we see. We see children who cannot manage a really high arousing situation. So even sitting in a classroom for these children will be very difficult because they go in halfway up the scale already. So you haven't got a lot of flexibility. You start getting a bit bored or don't understand the question, then you can find that these children cannot sit through even classrooms. So the impact isn't just emotional, it's cognitive, it is educational, and that spans out into the employment market and to society in general. And once you get to children of 8 to 12 years, you can actually watch their physiological response. Their heart rate is higher, their skin conductance is more. They are physiologically impacted greatly because they've been exposed to this adverse childhood experience. So what does all these papers tell us? Well, we know children who are exposed to parental violence between each other have more internalising, so they're more likely to be anxious, to be depressed, to be self-harming, suicidal, and externalising behaviour. So they're more likely to be aggressive and disruptive and confrontational as well. Now there's mixed results. If you do find a difference between externalising and internalising, you will find that girls are more likely to internalise and boys are more likely to externalise. But essentially what you are seeing is symptoms, you are seeing behaviours that are symptomatic of distress. So whether you shout or whether you cry, it is still distress. The distress is authentic and it deserves to be recognised and addressed. Yes, so I think we've pretty much done that. So there's no evidence that the sex of a parent is important gender-wise. So no differences when you only look at the male partner's violence or both partners' violence. There are no studies that only asked about mum's violence to dads. There are quite a lot of studies that only ask about dad's violence to mum, including the World Health Organisation. They deliberately do not ask. Their question about adverse childhood experiences asked about mother being hit. I think there was one country, it might have been Turkey maybe, who actually said, no, we want both parents in there. So when we talk about excluding, not even recognising it, is a deliberate behaviour to take out dads from a question and not even ask about it. What we know as well is that there is a dose response. So the more adversity you experience, the more harmful, potentially, the impact of that. And we know children who are exposed to domestic violence, whether by mum, dad or both parents, have significant impairment, potentially, in their relationships with their friends. They find it hard to have close relationships. They end up with quite coercive relationships often. They find it difficult to manage conflict in their own relationships and are more likely to use violence. They find it difficult to find partners who aren't similarly aggressive, because non-aggressive partners often don't want to be partnered with somebody who's aggressive and under-controlled. And this is a clear pattern, this dose response. For more your exposure, the more the harm. So exposure to intimate partner violence is associated with adverse childhood experiences. It's the most common one, but it's also a really good predictor of additional exposure. So if you have IPV, partner violence between caregivers, the majority of children who have that will have another adverse childhood experience in there, be it neglect, physical abuse, and so forth. 74% of children exposed to domestic violence will also have 2 more adverse childhood experiences, and 64% will have 3 or more. And if you've got a dose response, you start seeing that each additional one creates additional risk. So there's some data from the UK. We're quite interested in this generally, adverse childhood experiences. And we know that, so this is one about sexual behaviour. The graphs look very similar to males and females, look pretty much the same. As the number of adverse childhood experiences increase, so does problematic sexual behaviour, so does physical health complaints. So if you've got 4 ACEs, you're far more likely to get cancer, strokes, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, digestive liver disease, respiratory disease. Essentially, the more adversity you experience early in life, the quicker you will die. All things being equal. There are things we can do. We can, there's groups and interventions we can help people manage this negative, dysregulated emotion, which seems to be the thing that drives this relationship. But it should at least make us think that it is important that we recognise the most common adverse childhood experience is exposure to domestic abuse. And it doesn't matter who's doing it, whether it's male or female. If we want to help children and society, we need to be really on this. The World Health Organization tells us and reminds us that abuse and neglect of children does cause acute emotional harm. So it should be stopped for that reason. But the long-term harm is a problem to the child, it's a problem for society, and it's a problem for the whole world, because we live in the environment with these people. And we should help them for them, but we should help them for ourselves as well. So there are protective factors, such as giving children a sense of control, hope, self-esteem, helping them regulate their own emotional experiences. Children who are intelligent tend to fare a little better. Positive relationships, so if you're a teacher and you be that person that looks at that child and talks to them, that can be enough to give people that protective factor that they can experience this and grow up to have great relationships. But for those children that don't have these factors, it really does look quite dire. So the implications are, it is a damaging thing being exposed, regardless of whether you're a boy or a girl, or mum or dad, or both using violence. It's the most common adverse childhood experience. We should ask about fathers and mothers' use of violence, otherwise we're not getting a full picture, because there's no difference on the impact. These findings are inconsistent with the EU and the World Health Organization's focus on women and girls, continually focusing on women and girls, and it's inconsistent with a focus on men as perpetrators and a problem in society. Thank you.
Bueno, pues ahora vamos a tener la disertación de Marta Iglesias, que nos va a hablar de la parte profunda que tiene todo esto. Adelante, Marta.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me for the Your Mind series. It's really nice to be part of this initiative. So, before we delve deeper into the details of female aggression, since I'm going to talk about the more general perspectives or evolutionary perspectives of the aggression, I would like to start with a more general discussion. I would like to start to talk about the tools and ways of thinking that we have available to us to address our collective problems. So when we pass laws and when we discuss societal problems, we usually have in mind the issues that our citizens are facing. So we have in mind the problems that, such as drug addiction, suicides, or various forms of crime, from vandalism to murder. And all these are specific problems that usually have specific immediate triggers, and that's why there are necessary that's why they demand specific policies and legislative solutions. But in another sense, our social problems are all specific manifestations of a more general human nature. These problematic behaviors are manifestations of the principles that human beings use to solve their life's problems since time immemorial. So, for example, crime partly arises because human beings have always fought over dominance using aggression. So we have this aggression as a tool to solve the problems when we have to solve any conflict. And we always fought to exclude and to avoid being excluded. And like in another species, we have developed strategies to deal with defeat and to maximally exploit our victories. So to understand and prevent crime maybe can be helpful to better understand the universal human desire to dominate. By analogy, it might be worth taking the time to examine human nature when solving other sociological problems as well. And the hope is that by better understanding this human nature and motivations that we have, we can try to figure out how to try to control it, to modulate it, or maybe we can even try to channel it towards productive behaviors rather than anti-productive or counterproductive behaviors. So my goal today in this talk is I'm going to try to apply this more general framework to understand the problems of aggression among females. In the talk, I will first lay out some clear evidence that female aggression is a real phenomenon, and it might be a contributor to many current social problems. Next, I will take a brief look into the biological reasons behind why female aggressions behave so aggressively, and I also will provide a bit of the analysis on the evolutionary triggers of aggressive behavior, and then maybe we can discuss a bit about these more practical implications of the current research. So, when we talk about aggression, we often think about men, and for a good reason. So men are much more likely to murder, to rape, or to generally use physical violence in disputes. Most of our prisons are filled by men. But just because the male physical aggression is a greater problem in our society, it does not mean that female aggression is harmless or is non-existent. So what we know is that female aggression is less noticeable because it usually does not express itself in the form of overt physical aggression. When we talk about other forms of more specific forms of aggression, like intimate partner violence or aggression between the families and with the kids, we see that women can use this physical aggression to deal with conflicts, but in general, women use more indirect means like bullying and reputation harming. And left unchecked, this indirect aggression, it might create very real problems in society. So we know the relationship, we know that it's expressed in the form of social isolation or bullying. And well, just to give you an example, it's recently been shown that I can use this. You can see the recently rise in the dramatic self-harm rates among teenagers. It's lately been linked with an increase also in bullying facilitated by the social media. And well, it is true that in these cases we do need more studies, we need more information, but we know that there are some problematic effects to this indirect aggression. We know how this affects the psychological status of the individual, but the most honest attitude is to say that we really need more research on female aggression, because we don't know very well, we don't know much about the relationships between important issues like bullying and self-harm, as I show you, or bullying and work performance. So many of you might still be skeptical about this female aggression. So I just want to give you the following list of examples that I divided in few categories to give you a big look out of it. So this article shows that in the workplace, women report experiencing more incivility from other women than from men. This another study shows that females believe that other women are good managers, but in fact they don't want to work with them or work for them. This other study shows that because women often see highly qualified female candidates as a competitive threats and lower qualified female candidates as a collective threats, well, they don't want to work with them. They don't want to work with these females as peers. This study it's nice studies that show that within the partners, it's lesbian partners have experienced more physical violence than heterosexual partners or heterosexual women experience in a heterosexual relationship. This is in the same study. We see that more lesbian partners than gay partners also have experienced more violence within the couples. This one shows that some wars in the internet are going on in which one group of mothers is trying to brand the other group of mothers as if they had bad parenting ideas. This other study shows that female groups engaged in social ostracism more than male groups did. in the studies, it's a book in which he shows that while 15% of mother-in-law, son-in-law relationships have some tension, 60% of mother-in-law, daughter-in-law bonds are described with some, negative stress and bad relationship. Another study shows that women reported that they will invest less in partners of the same sex than high-status men in partners of the same sex. This other study shows that females reported more negative reactions than males when outperformed by their same-sex peers. This other study shows that females are more likely than males to respond to threats of social exclusion with more social exclusion. Another one shows that women reported their anger will dissipate less quickly and they will take longer to be friends again. This one is a really nice review in which they study the behavior of kids, and they show the girls are more often victims of social exclusion by their peers, as you see in the graphs, more than the boys. And in the same study, you can see also that the reasons why the girls are being bullied are the physical attractiveness, so the more pretty they are, they get more bullied. Also the sexual activity, and you see that in boys it happened kind of the opposite. This one studies the reasons why they engage in this indirect aggression, and it's usually about self-promotion and talking bad or spreading rumors and the question the fidelity or the level of promiscuity of the rival of the other girl. This study shows that women damage rivals' reputation in private, but they actually do not report in public just disliking them. And this is a really nice study because we have been seeing this for a long time. So I hope by now that you have been convinced that women do exhibit some kind of systematic aggressive tendencies. But you might still be asking, why does it matter? Because it's not the case that in most of these examples that I just talked about, what happened is like things like bullying, name calling, or just being rude. So for this, we have two answers. I mean, the question is, does this indirect aggression have any impact in the aggregated level? So we have two answers to this. So many forms of female aggression do cross the line from unpleasant to the truly damaging, as we saw in the previous talks. But we shouldn't ignore the damage from indirect aggressions. So let's take the example of bullying. When females bully their subordinates, or when they fail to support the hiring of other females, well, they are indirectly undermining all these diversity initiatives that we want to make to work. When the discussions about mothering practices in the internet turn into flame wars, when one side is trying to brand the other side as inferior, well, we lose the ability to jointly figure out parenting practices. And I think we all know that this has been a big issue lately. And more broadly, adolescent aggressive tendencies, such as the inability of little schoolgirls to repair friendships or just have some friendly competition, well, it undermines the ability of society to cooperate. And this we know that have some long-term effects in how we do cooperate as adults. Well, we don't know the relationship, but we know the cooperation in adults, it's kind of different. So I probably just overwhelmed both the audience and myself with a long or specific examples of female aggression. But when you listen to these examples, I hope you notice some common themes, the way that female participates in aggression has a certain pattern to it. So let's just repeat a few more examples to highlight the pattern. For example, wives mostly fight with other mother-in-laws and not father-in-laws or brothers. In the workplace, women mainly bully other women rather than men, and even little schoolgirls have trouble getting along with other girls, and not that it doesn't happen in boys. So cross-cultural meta-analysis are the important analysis here, because they summarize a wide variety of studies in which they include results from different countries with different methodologies and different results. Well, they confirm that we can see the strength of this behavior, and they confirm this trend that I've been showing you. So when women commit aggressive acts, they usually do so against other women, and they usually use also indirect forms of aggression, such as reputation harming, slander, and rumors as their main tool. And this can be summarized in this graph, in which we can see the differences in the types of aggression than men and women use. And we can see that men use more physical and verbal aggression, and women use more indirect aggression. This is a really nice meta-analysis. And what we can also say is that the differences exist since early childhood. So we can observe that from 6 years old, we already observe differences in how men and women, or boys and girls, perform this aggression. And we can see there is more, physical aggression is more used in boys, and in verbal aggression too. And with this data given from the self-reports, we can think that maybe there is no difference in how women and men, or boys and girls, compete, or how they attack each other. But this is because we are taking into account only the data of the self-reports. If we check the data from the peer reports, the data that give the teachers, the family, we can see that the differences in aggression is high from the early childhood, and progressively increase with age, both in physical aggression and indirect aggression. And this differences peaks in the moment of optimal reproduction from the biological point of view. So it is now natural to wonder why. Why do we exhibit such patterns of aggression in particular? Why is female aggression type so different from the typical male method? So to think about the answers, I want to go deeper into the biological explanations. But first, let me give you a little, Let me give you a little introduction to the meaning of evolution. So, biological explanations of the human nature originate from the fields of evolutionary game theory, evolutionary ecology, behavioral ecology, evolutionary biology, and evolution, as well as we all know, is the main theory that we use to explain why human beings, why animals change over time. Just evolution can be used to explain why a bat got its wings, why raptors have a very good sight vision. No, we can also use the evolutionary theory can be used to explain how animal behavior and human behavior evolved over time. So evolutionary theory always asks what is the function of a particular behavior that we are observing. So, and by function, what we mean is that how does this behavior in particular support the ability to, for an organism to survive and reproduce, and to reproduce because we, all human beings, we all animals have something in common, that is that we are offspring. So we are the result of individuals that were able to reproduce and who in turn were the progeny of the other individuals that managed to do the same. And the ones that didn't manage to reproduce, they didn't leave a copy of themselves, so they do no longer exist. And accordingly, each living being is potentially reproductively effective because it is the offspring of some individuals that were also reproductively effective. So, but before I continue, it's important to stress that an evolutionary perspective is not prescriptive. It does not imply that what has evolved is morally good. It doesn't mean that if something was useful in the past for reproduction, is how things must continue. Rather, it's better understood as a theory which explains why human behavior is sometimes very stereotypic. So, because, human behavior is quite malleable, and yet despite this flexibility, it often tends towards stereotypic behaviors or patterns that we observe in the population all across the world. So with this caveat in mind, let's just take a look about what evolutionary theory tells us about aggression. So, from the study of other mammalian species, we can see that human beings, we are far from atypical. So, in most of other mammalian species, the males are larger and they spend most of the time competing or fighting by themselves, and the benefits of winning those fights are clear. So the one who wins is the one that the female deems most attractive, so it gets the chance to father most of the children. In some species like a deer, females dominate mostly all the territory, and they get to father most of the children, and the females come to them almost like voluntarily. But the case of the human species is not so extreme. So we have, our infants are really vulnerable and for really long periods of time, so they require quite a bit parental care. So women and men typically pair up in small groups, family groups, to take care of the offspring. And this means that not only men has to compete amongst themselves to look attractive for the females, but females also have to compete to get chosen by men. And this explains much of the aggression that happens within the sex. So men fight with other men, and women compete with other women to get chosen. So certainly our cultural dimension affects the way we reproduce, but we cannot modify that much this the mechanisms that are behind, because these mechanisms that we have evolved to choose a mate and to reproduce are a product of our biology that passed down along a lineage of successful breeders. So there is another interesting component, that is that infant care, we have seen in the studies that is not only useful if it comes from the parents, but it is also useful for kids if the help also comes from the other members of the group. So particularly if they come from other women. So this established a second line of conflict. No, this not only women compete amongst themselves for a suitable father for the offspring, but they also compete between themselves for the help of the group. And in addition to all the above ideas, well, we have more observations. So as we have been seeing, female aggression takes place without the use of direct means, as we saw, and this observation, it looks like also have an evolutionary explanation. So this greater use of indirect aggression is often attributed to the way that the human reproduction works. So for women, their reproduction success depends very much on their ability to take care of the offspring, but also to gestate. The fertility also, it's a nice indicator of the success of a woman. So women have an incentive to try to avoid suffering physical risks as much as they can. Otherwise, they will put their fertility in risk. And this conflict, as we have seen, what it looks like is solved by the using of indirect means. But as we also saw in the previous talks, there are some moments in which the female aggression goes from indirect to more direct forms of aggression. And this is because aggression is a behavior that is really context dependent. So as we saw in the partner violence and in the violence towards kids, there are so many cases in which if we analyze the context, we can see how it develops. So, for example, if we if the resources are scarce, we also see the females use more direct aggression. And if the relationship so the ratio of female to males are really high and the competition increases, we also observe in the population that the physical aggression with females also increases. I just wanted to point it out that even though we observe this more physical aggression in some specific moments, evolution in general has avoided direct confrontation among women. This is the best understanding that we have about how evolution can affect the way we show aggression in today's world. And I have more information about the influence of hormones and the influence of the genetic component. We are just about to conclude. So there is this one more component of biology that is of interest when we want to understand how aggression unfolds. That is that the evolutionary analysis emphasized certainly heavily certain strategic factors like taking care of the children or competing for mates. But though these considerations are strategic, they are not necessarily implemented through strategic planning. In fact, most of these impulses seems to remain subconscious within us, and they are implemented through a wide variety of subconscious mechanisms, such as the action of hormones and deep brain circuits. So hormones certainly have an influence on how likely we are to commit aggression. The aggressive tendencies during puberty, increases or peaks when we have more hormonal hormones in the bodies of boys and girls. And also, in addition to hormones, we have also a genetic component to consider. And the meta-analysis of heritability studies shows that I pointed it in red, almost 40% of the inter-individual variation in our antisocial and aggressive behaviors are explained by the genetical component. And, well, I just want to give you with some conclusions of the latest research. It's women engage in several forms of aggressive behavior. The primary type seems to be reputation harming, which is directed mainly to other women. And this behavior changes how to cooperate in groups, and in extreme cases it can lead to ostracism. The female tendencies towards indirect aggression, same-sex aggression, seems to be explained by a revolutionary need to compete for the best mate and for the best social support, but while at the same time avoiding lasting physical damage to our bodies. And about 40% of the variation between tendencies towards aggressive behavior is modulated by genes, and during our lifetime these genetic influences are implemented through the wiring of our brain at the level of hormones in our bodies. And of course, we need more research in how non-physical aggression has a real impact on society. Thank you.
Bueno, pues muchas gracias, Marta, por poner en el paisaje los temas que estamos hablando hoy sobre los diferentes tipos de agresión masculina y femenina.